May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? We will be beginning our final panel in about 2 minutes, so please find a seat. No, you're fine, you're fine. Sorry. If you would like to find your seats, we will be beginning the final panel, so please find your seats.
Elizabeth, my mic is not on. Okay, is my mic on? Okay. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Please do take your seats, and we will begin. This is our final panel for the afternoon, and of course, you've just heard from two wonderful panels, and also from a number of lunch speakers. All of you may be feeling a little bit sleepy right now, but I promise you that you will wake up as a result of the next three speakers. And in fact, not only will you wake up, but I can assure you that you will be awake but not woke. You will be energized, but in a way that I think the progressives would find quite dismaying. I am Daniel McCarthy. I am the Vice President for the Collegiate Network here at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. The Collegiate Network is our student publications division. I am also the editor of Modern Age, which is ISI's own publication, a journal of conservative thought. Now, you've all been very good throughout this day in terms of asking questions via the ISI app. So we encourage you to continue to do that. As you listen to our panelists this afternoon, please do have questions ready. Go ahead and ask them on the app. And then, of course, you can ask them in person, too. But the app will allow us to make things quite smooth and well-coordinated. Another housekeeping note before we begin is that you have an opportunity to win a number of prizes through interaction with ISI's social media. So if you don't already follow the Intercollegiate Studies Institute on Facebook, please do so right now. And you'll notice that there is a Facebook post referring to the ISI giveaway. So go ahead and turn your phone on. You can look at it, like the Facebook page for ISI, and look for that post. Go ahead and like it, and that will give you a chance to win a number of prizes. Similarly, on Twitter, please do follow the ISI on Twitter. It's just at ISI. And you'll see that there are posts there, too, that refer to the ISI giveaway. Go ahead and like one of those or retweet it, and that will also enter you for this chance to win a prize. The prizes include, the grand prize will be a signed copy of the conservative book of the year, The Dying Citizen, by Victor Davis Hanson, plus a year-long subscription to the world's finest journal, Modern Age, as well as a surprise ISI-branded item. Now, even I do not know what this is, but I'm sure it will be something that will be life-changing and transformative. So let's go ahead and get on to our panelists as we begin to discuss the present state of the university and some of the fundamental difficulties it is confronting. Immediately to my left is Patrick Deneen, who is professor of political philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of many books, including Why Liberalism Failed. And no less a liberal than former President Barack Obama has said of that book, "I don't agree with most of the author's conclusions, but the book offers cogent insights into the loss of meaning and community that many in the West feel, issues that liberal democracies ignore at their peril." Next to Patrick, and in the middle, is Jennifer Frey, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina. She is also a faculty fellow at the Institute for Humane Ecology at the Catholic University of America, and a member of the Executive Council of the Society of Christian Philosophers. Last but far from least is Jason Hill, a professor of philosophy at DePaul University. He is the author of 5 books, including We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People, and What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. Now, we're about to discuss the state of the university. Obviously, we know that wokeness has presented a number of new and acute problems. But the answer to wokeness, which many conservatives have long proposed, academic freedom, is something that itself has been controversial on the right for a considerable period of time. In fact, as many ISI folks will know, one of the first books of the conservative intellectual movement in the post-war era in 1951 was William F. Buckley's God and Man at Yale, the subtitle of which was The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. And subsequently, there were books on academic freedom published by Russell Kirk in 1955 and by Robert Nisbet, one called The Degradation of Academic Dogma in 1971. So academic freedom, the nature and the mission of the university, and the state of the higher education has been something of keen interest to conservatives for a very long time. Academic freedom has been, in fact, something of a football, something of an item of controversy among conservatives. And yet, right now, in the face of a woke onslaught, in the face of an orthodoxy that is very oppressive to anyone who is not on the far left, academic freedom has started to seem as if it is indeed a bulwark and a fastness for any kind of intellectual liberty, any kind of intellectual virtue as well upon our campuses. So with that preamble out of the way, let me turn it over to Patrick Deneen.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks very much to ISI for this invitation. It's been great to be back. I think it's been many years since I was at this lovely location, and it's really brings back a lot of memories. And now with the structure being built, I hope many more memories are to be built in the future. So I'm looking forward to that. So I guess I'll begin. I was speaking to a few VCs, venture capitalists, earlier today. And I was asking one of them, I said, what's a really good return on investment? And he told me that one of his best was 35 times his investment in 5 years. That'd be pretty good. So imagine, let's just imagine a world in which those of you who might be donors or supporters of ISI, your investment returns 1,000 times in the next year. In other words, everything that we all might hope would happen at the university happens. The universities are transformed. The woke world ceases to dominate the universities, and our people take over the positions. We command the heights of the institutions. Can we imagine in such a situation, can we imagine such a situation? Maybe not, but if such a thing were to happen, can we imagine that we would be meeting here after that a year later, and in which our topic, the burning topic of one of 3 possible panels on the university would be academic freedom? Probably not. It would probably not be the top of our agenda. It would probably be, it would probably not be the agenda, among other things, because such an institution, such a university, would be doing the things that we thought were most important of universities to be doing. It would be transmitting and exploring the foundational ideas of the Western tradition. It would be doing the things that David Whalen in the earlier panel were talking about. A contested tradition, but nevertheless a tradition, one that's visible and one that we value and we treasure and we seek to pass on. It would be approaching and engaging with questions about our own tradition, the American tradition, our Constitution, our religious, our historical traditions. It might be places, especially I think about the institution I teach at, University of Notre Dame, and this range of private universities, for which is really unique in the world. Most of the nations of the world don't have our system of private universities, almost all of which were founded in religious traditions, but which have abandoned those traditions. So imagine part of that revival is a revival of those religious traditions, the institutions that see themselves as in some ways formed around an idea and an ideal of what the purpose and end and telos of this life and the next life are. And in such a world, I would think any institution would not be homogeneous, again, to echo David's points earlier. If we know anything about living within a religious tradition, it's not homogeneous. It's not a tradition without disagreement. But it is, in some ways, you have a shared vocabulary. You have a shared set of understandings. The questions that you debate over, in some ways, are a result of that tradition. And in such a condition, we would have something that I think we would, in some ways, recognize as a kind of community. A community of scholars, a community of students who share certain presuppositions and ideas. They might draw different conclusions from those presuppositions. And this kind of community, at its base, is why we call these places colleges, which if we think etymologically what that word means, a college is a place of colleagueship. It's a collegium. It's a place of people, a community of inquirers who, again, sharing a broad worldview, inquire and search and explore within that tradition, both passing on that tradition, but also testing that tradition against and through the times that we happen to live, the challenges, unique challenges that our time presents to us. Now, in such a situation, should such a collegium base itself on the idea that we must organize ourselves around the idea of inviting and encouraging anyone in our midst to challenge the fundamental presuppositions, to confront, to overturn the fundamental presuppositions of this collegium? Is that the purpose and end of this gathering, of this institution, of this group? Is that the end and purpose for which we are organized? Or are there ways within every tradition that we can draw on aspects or strands of that tradition by which, without betraying that tradition, and without betraying that sort of, let's just say, practice of inquiry, we can continue this tradition while engaging, questioning, searching, and probing without abandoning it, without seeking to overturn it? And I raise this as a scenario because this is in some ways precisely what happened with academic freedom in the earlier part of the 20th century and into the middle part of the 20th century. Why did all of these religious-affiliated private institutions cease to be that way? Right? Why was William F. Buckley, among others, a critic of academic freedom? It was precisely because academic freedom was a major project of the progressive movement and the effort of progressives to overturn and to cease, in some ways, to bring to conclusion or bring to an end those founding traditions of those institutions, to overturn especially the basis of that collegium. Academic freedom then was in many ways an effort especially to displace the collegium that governed the kind of inquiry and questioning within those institutions, and to replace it what we now today regard as the precursor of the woke university, the progressive university, the research university, in which our identity as faculty and our identity as students is no longer that institution, but the disciplines that then take their marker and take their inspiration from what become increasingly progressive understandings of humanity. Progress understood in the broadest sense, but also in the sense that we would recognize the transformation of human nature, the transformation of our society, the disruption of a traditional society, the overturning of tradition in the name of progress. Go to any college campus. Somebody was talking earlier today, Michael was talking earlier today about the architecture of campuses. And just look on college campuses and you'll see the physical legacy of that transformation in the form of the buildings. The ugliest buildings on the campus will be the legacy of this tradition. The beautiful buildings will typically be the legacy of an earlier tradition, one that was drawing on a sort of classical and traditional legacy. In other words, what I'm trying to point out is that academic freedom, certainly as it was understood in the earlier part, in the middle part of the 20th century, had a philosophy. It had an implicit philosophy bound up in it that I think we are seeing the fruits of. And conservatives and traditionalists and those who would seek to restore or to renew the university need to be careful and need to understand what exactly is being promoted and promulgated in the encouragement of an embrace of academic freedom now against the woke ideology. In some ways, just to bring this to a close, I think that, of course, there are institutional specific reasons why a defense of academic freedom might be, in some ways, a second best option today. It can be a second best or even third best prudential option in places in which to say or to think or not think, but to discuss certain things is exceedingly difficult in a lot of the elite private institutions and a lot of the state schools and so forth. But I think what we need to understand is that it is a second best. It is not the end or purpose that those of us, I think, in this not room but in this tent should be thinking about. Rather, what we should really be thinking about, and the goal and the prize that we should really be oriented to, is how and in what way can we reconstitute a collegium at the various institutions that we might have a particular affection or devotion to. What would be the ways of constituting a collegium of faculty and of students? Some places it might be the only possibility is maybe an off-campus program or an institute, or the kinds of things, again, that were talked about earlier today. That might be the sort of the best option that's possible to us. In other institutions, I like to think that it's my own institution, a place like Notre Dame, there's still enough of that collegium there, and there's still enough of that tradition there, that I actually don't think academic freedom is in particular the route that we should go, or not unless it's of a particular kind, a particular sort. We should be seeking to strengthen and to revive the tradition, certainly the Catholic tradition of our institution. And this means looking to hire, and this means looking to shape a curriculum and to inculcate and to draw students who want to be part of that tradition and part of that conversation. So it seems to me that we're going to need to think strategically, we're going to need to think prudentially, we're going to need to think not in the, I think as RJ was talking about earlier, not in terms of a kind of top-down rationalistic way, but with a kind of capacity to think prudentially and with wisdom about the particular institutions that we might be inhabiting. But I just would want to inject a note of caution, especially today, that we not mistake the ideal of a kind of contentless academic freedom for what it is we actually seek, or what we should actually seek, which is the effort to form, to reform, to strengthen, both through faculty, the presence of faculty, the kind of institution, its traditions, the kind of curriculum that we seek to advance, and certainly the kinds of students we seek to form and cultivate and foster, that this be the fundamental aim, object, and purpose and goal of what we should be oriented to. And if academic freedom serves that in a particular instance, well and good. But if it doesn't, then perhaps it's not the aim and object that we should really be advancing. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of what I want to say is going to dovetail nicely with what Patrick was saying. I mean, I do appreciate that you mentioned or you acknowledged that not all universities are the same, right? We tend to, I mean, we're talking about the state of the university, but universities come in many shapes and kinds and sizes. And, you know, we're both at R1 universities, but I am at a very large state-funded university. Or at least we're funded in theory. In practice, not so much. I think we get 9% of our budget right now from the state after the 2008 recession. But we're still a state university, and our governor appoints certain members of our board of trustees, and we are accountable to the people, the great people of South Carolina. And we're not religious, right? And I am religious. I'm a Roman Catholic, but I have always been in secular schools. So that's the context in which I live and breathe and have been educated myself. And I think that when we are thinking about academic freedom, we have to be sensitive to the different kinds of contexts. And we also have to look at the different reality that you get at an institution like mine. Again, I'm at the University of South Carolina. And what you see going on at Yale and Harvard, I feel like the Ivy League institutions, they play this outsized role in our imagination, and that's questionable. It's questionable that that should be the case because the majority of students are not in those institutions. And it's not clear that Harvard is a better university than the University of South Carolina. But at any rate, setting that aside, I mean, I myself, I struggle with saying general things about academic freedom because I have to be honest that for me, there's a bit of a gap between what I think about it in theory and how I will behave in practice. So one of the things that I need to think more about is, or maybe we can think more about, is how to bring theory and practice into closer alignment. But I'll just begin by saying what I think academic freedom is. I'm a philosopher, so I care a lot about those sorts of questions. And what I want to say is that freedom isn't just license, right? That's not the correct understanding of freedom. When we are talking about freedom, we're not talking about just the lack of external constraints. We're talking about freedom to attain and secure some good, right? Freedom is only a good thing insofar as it is for attaining and preserving some good. And when we're talking about academic freedom in particular, what is the principal good, like the principal, primary, essential good that's at stake? And that, of course, is the truth. The reason why we have academic freedom is so that there can be free inquiry into the truth. Truth as understood within the norms of the various disciplines that you will find within the university, right? So the way that the philosopher is going to seek truth isn't the same as the way that the physicist or the social scientist is going to seek truth, but I am very committed to the idea that they are all seeking the truth, at least if they're doing it correctly, within their disciplinary norms. And so we need to be really clear when we're talking about academic freedom that it's not just a freedom, it's not just an individual right or an individual license, that we're talking about the good. And that we're talking about the good that especially belongs to the university. It is the university's mission to secure the truth. But I would also say that we need to try, insofar as it's possible, to recover the idea that we're talking about a common good. Right? The truth is sort of like the highest common good of the university, and it ought to structure in some very important sense, our self-understanding as members of the university, but certainly how we're thinking about academic freedom. And another thing that resonates with me about what you were saying is that the university is a society, right? And we've really lost that sense that the university is a society, right? What's a society? A society is any time you have rational agents acting together, right, for a common good. When you have that, you have an actual society. And I think that when we're talking about academic freedom, we have to be talking about the freedom to participate in that society, understood specifically as that society which is oriented towards seeking the truth, again, according to the various disciplinary norms that you will find in the various departments of a university. And I think that one of the problems that we have in current debates about academic freedom is that it's become sort of very denatured, right? So we've lost the talk of truth and the common good, which, by the way, you will find talk of truth and the common good in the original AAUP statement from 1940. It's all there. But if we're talking about society and the common good, we're in the space of virtue, right? I mean, this is the space where virtue gets a grip. And again, if you go back to the original statement of academic freedom from the AAUP, they talk about how academic freedom needs to be exercised. So they talk a lot about mutual respect and self-restraint and self-control and collegiality. And this, I think, has also been lost. But again, if we're talking about freedom to pursue some good, there has to be some sense of the virtues that are necessary for the proper exercise of that freedom. And if we're talking about truth, we have to be talking about civility, right? And we have to be talking about humility. And I think we also need to be talking about fortitude, right? So this kind of courage to doggedly pursue the truth in the face of various obstacles. And the university ought to be committed to that. They absolutely ought to be committed to that. And they ought to be committed to it not just as something that it's going to preserve for its faculty, but they need to be educating, we need to be educating our students about what academic freedom really is, about what freedom really is, about what it's for. And here where, I mean, so right now when it comes to my own way of dealing with this stuff, I'm sort of a straight up libertarian, right? So I'll just defend your academic freedom no matter how false I think your view is. And of course, I want to strengthen and keep tenure protections. I think it would be a huge mistake to get rid of that. And I fight, for example, at my own university for something like the Chicago Statement on Academic Freedom. I tried to get that passed through our faculty senate. I failed, but I will keep trying. And I think that I think that you need to do that right now in order to preserve a space for conservatives on campus. If you get rid of these things, if you get rid of academic freedom, then I think you are probably going to be getting rid of conservatives on campus. But I do think something that the institutions that we do have for preserving and advocating for academic freedom, like FIRE and the Academic Freedom Alliance, these are good institutions, but I think they could do a better job of articulating what academic freedom is and what it's for. Yeah, so maybe I'll just end there.
Well, thank you, ISI, for having me here again for I think the fourth time in a couple of months, about 5 months. This is my fourth appearance. I've been a college professor for 25 years, And when I emigrated from Jamaica, I could not have imagined that the university professoriate would have evinced so much hatred for the American people and for the Republic. I think I run the risk of becoming a statistician of gutter trivia by outlining all the ways in which the universities have become indoctrination centers, bastions of left-wing ideology. We know if we read the newspapers that whether we're talking about Harvard or colleges across the country, there are exceptions, that the war on reason, the war on logic as means of adjudicating, disputing truth claims is coin of the realm. We know that the decolonization of the Western canon of texts is running amok. We know that there's a general appeal that the Western canon and that reason and logic are the creations of racist, imperialist white men. And if you have any doubt that the universities and its intellectuals are the transmission belts of culture, just look at the mission statement now of Coca-Cola that has called for the decentering of whiteness and has called for its employees to be less white, which means something like being less on time, being less excellent, being less sure of yourself, and being less confident. This is the poisonous trend that we see in the universities. So if you doubt that there is an ethos that permeates our culture and suffuses our culture, that begins in the universities by the professoriate, who hate America and hate this great country because it is great and because it is good, hatred of the good because it is good. Look to the DEI statements that are permeating our small businesses and our corporations. So again, I don't want to be a statistician of gutter trivia by ostensibly pointing to all the ways in which the professoriate hate this country. We read the newspapers. We see the woke supremacists assaulting the First Amendment by shutting down free speech, by calling people like Condoleezza Rice a war criminal, by preventing her from coming on campuses across college campuses in this country, by preventing Ben Shapiro from appearing on college campuses, by forcing Christina Hoff Sommers, who's a dissident feminist, to have to walk with bodyguards on American college campuses. The question is, we can reflect on the provenance of these destructive afflictions against the academy, and we could go back to the importation of critical theory, postmodern and deconstructionist thought, the Frankfurt School, of which gave rise to the revolutionary victim studies programs of the 1960s, like black studies, women's studies, post-colonial studies, LGBT studies, all of which declared war on the Western canon and the trajectory of Western civilization, the use of reason and logic, again, as unassailable, incontrovertible tools to arbitrate among disputing truth claims. And this sort of epistemological calumny of their combined methodologies led to the elevation of ethical and cultural relativism as a national norm and now a cult that is ruling our culture, where every opinion of every single village idiot carries the same weight as a seasoned expert in our culture, where every single sophomoric high school opinion uttered by a village idiot is elevated to the level of human knowledge. It has suffused discourse in one way or another and has led to the suspension and outright disbelief in the idea that there is an objective reality that exists independently of the private conscience held and possessed by each individual. Our universities are not just national security threats. They exist now for the major purpose of dismantling Western civilization and the U.S. Republic by fundamentally changing the political DNA of this country. I regard them as nihilistic apex predators and the transmission belt of socialism. So what is the ultimate bottom line? They are existential disruptors and intellectual terrorist domestic silos that have morphed into one irreducible primary, the categorical destruction of the Republic, where the cultivation of excellence and the high goal of preparing our students to be sovereign and autonomous citizens has been superseded by overt political consciousness raising with the goal of assaulting the First Amendment and to invoke strategic systemic nihilism for the destruction of all values that undergird the Republic. Now, how did we get here? Liberalism. The beauty, and I'm not an enemy of course, political liberalism, but the beauty and tragedy of political liberalism is that it allowed everyone into the historical process and ipso facto into the future. Heaps and heaps of people have been thrust upon history at such an accelerated speed that it is impossible to incorporate them into the traditional culture in a secure and fastened manner. The democratization of any sphere of life, whether it is art, education, just walk through the airports and see what the democratization of travel looks like on an airplane, comes at an expense. It means leveling down mankind or humankind to the common denominator of its least competent members. So a new sovereign mass, an intractable mass that constitutes a confederacy of nihilistic individuals, supplanters, nihilistic supplanters, who arbitrarily and without adhering to philosophic meaning tests imposes its own desires and vulgar tastes on the rest of society. They crush everything that imposes or opposes their codified orthodox views. Anything that is excellent, exceptional, anything that goes against the cult of mediocrity, anything that is individual is opposed by them. We have an illiberal phalanx of value detractors that wish to impose a homogeneity of rules that valorizes equal outcomes based on unequal causes as a ruling principle. So I would say that metaphysical egalitarianism, the belief that the equality of all persons outside the strictly political sense, that is equality before the law, is the norm. And we are not all equal. We're not equal in intelligence, we're not equal in beauty, we're not equal in athletic prowess, we're not equal in values, in frugality. And how do you begin the process of redistributing values among persons when equality of outcome quite often rests on the values and the principles that we hold? So equal results from unequal causes and equal rewards for unequal performance is the ruling premise of today's systemic nihilists. So what is the antidote? Well, I would think that there are a couple of antidotes. One is to defund the universities entirely, including the social, especially the social sciences and the humanities, and to replace them with conservative thinkers that can build the university from the ground up with conservative values and principles. To close down completely the Department of Education, which is a toxic system that did not always exist. To the extent that hyperdemocracy is the problem, we need to invoke a system of rational discrimination and rational exclusion. Not everyone can be let into the future. And the promise of liberalism and the promise of hyperdemocracy was that it did not invoke a vetting process that was extreme enough to exclude those who did not belong into the educational system in the first place. So we need to adopt a ruthless meritocratic imperative that will expel what I would call the unvetted social ballasts that liberalism has generously allowed to govern and rule. The jungle, ladies and gentlemen, are not approaching the cities. They have become the cities, and the barbarians are not at the gates. They are inside the cities. So hyperdemocracy that has got to be reconsidered, and the democratization of any sphere leads to a de-leveling of standards, which leads to involution and retrogression. Practically, we could have, finally, in the practical sense, we could have a separation of the research departments, especially in the sciences, from the undergraduate realms. We could expel students who cause uproar and who prevent and prohibit the exercise of free speech from campus. I would expel these students outright from the universities. They have rebranded the educational system via an inverted cognitive primitive pyramid, which I call the reification of the zero, or the elevation of a value, a non-value to a cult. There's much more that can be said, But I think the solution and the antidote lies right here in students like ISI, students that believe in the supremacy of the United States of America and the values for which it stands, students that believe in conservative values that are not nihilistic, but that are constitutive values that have a track record and that can fight the nihilism or the nihilism, however you pronounce it in American parlance, I'm not sure. We say nihilism. But fight for the right of conservative values that undergird the American Republic and that have a codified track record of sustaining the goodness of this country. Thank you.
So as our audience members prepare their questions on the app and also in person, I have one question for all three panelists, although it has different ramifications for each one. So the version of it for Patrick is, can a university like Notre Dame function as both a Catholic collegium while also being a major research university, or is there a mission contradiction involved in that? A version of that question for Jennifer is, if a university like the University of South Carolina cannot have a religious foundation, then what would be the foundation of collegium at a place like USC? And then my question for Professor Hill is reason, which you have talked about very eloquently, a sufficient basis for the kind of collegium that Patrick has alluded to, or is reason always going to fall before the onslaught of one kind or another of faith, whether it's a faith in wokeism, whether it's a traditional Catholic or Christian faith, or whether it's a faith that may be Islam or something else that's quite different, or even Marxism? We'll start with Patrick.
Sure. Well, I mean, Notre Dame is a very, very particular and, let's say, an outlier in pretty much every university that one can think of, in the sense that it's trying to do, we could name at least half a dozen things it's trying to do and trying to do well, but let me name three. The first is to be a world-class R1 research university, to be in the top tier, the top rank of producing new knowledge, of attracting faculty who are the top researchers in whatever field and discipline one can name. And tenure, advancement, promotion is based upon that set of criteria. The second thing it's trying to do is trying to be a great undergraduate college, a place that is devoted to the intellectual, moral, cultural, and character formation of undergraduates who attend this university, for the most part because they know it's a Catholic institution and it's an institution where the focus is upon undergraduates and undergraduate life. And the third thing it's trying to do is to be faithful to its Catholic tradition and to the Catholic magisterium. It's also trying to be a great athletic school, which that probably more than any of the other things I just named, that it does pretty well. The three things that I just mentioned, it's almost impossible to do those three things together. It's doing all of them marginally well, but not outstandingly well. And I think the trends that I see right now is that the undergraduate and the Catholic identity, number 2 and 3, are going to become subsumed to the first one. And this is because of the trends that I was suggesting earlier were part of the progressive movement and part of the original arguments for academic freedom going back to the early part of the 20th century. I'm not as big a fan of the 1940s AAUP statement as Jennifer, but put that to the side for a second. But the aim and ambition was to in some ways, to reorient the vision of the faculty away from their role as people who form the character and understood themselves as part of a collegium and a tradition, to see themselves as working as members of a community in which our mutual pursuit of the truth was something that we collectively and together undertook as a community. In other words, that it was the community of scholars at the institution using and employing and exploring the varieties of the nature of reality through our various disciplines that we achieved some approximation of a knowledge of the truth. And this was in and through communication with each other as part of a community. Part of a community through which we did this in and through our experience as teachers, through our interaction with our students and with each other. Now notice what the part of what the ambition of academic freedom as it was proposed in the 20th century was aimed to do, was to liberate, in a sense, or to require the liberation of faculty from identification as primarily that my work and role was as part of this collegium, and rather I was to identify now as a member of a discipline. The people I had most in common with and that I most engaged with in my academic life were not the people at my institution any longer. It was people in my discipline who happened to work anywhere else in the world, anywhere else, not just the country, but of course, but of the world. This was my community, were the people who were no longer at my institution. It was then to undermine the fabric of the institution, whatever that might have been, whatever the tradition of that institution, whatever the collegium of that institution. So there's a reason why institutions like Notre Dame, and this filters down not just from the R1 universities and Stasers, this filters down to the liberal arts colleges, which, of course, all of their faculty are trained at R1 universities, and they model themselves on the R1 universities. So this has profound effects over the whole range of higher education. So the end result of this is that there's a fragmentation within the institutions and an undermining of any sense that this is what the purpose and end of education is, often to the betrayal not just of the collegium, but to undergraduate education as a whole. Undergraduates as the end and purpose of what we aim to do. Now, just to put one final point on this, what I think we need to recognize is what we are confronted with isn't just that academic freedom was argued for in order to create this kind of free-for-all of people just doing what they wish. It was to replace one institution, one settlement with another settlement. Academic freedom was, in some sense, a kind of transitional philosophy of moving from the old collegium to the new woke university. It wasn't to just sit there and just say, we're just going to be academically free for the rest of eternity. It was to move to dismantle one institution in one form for another institution. And this is why academic freedom might seem for us now to be a shield, but what we need to understand is that it was a sword. It was a sword that was used, and when its work was accomplished, they dropped it on the ground, and now we pick it up and say, oh, look, a shield. Right? What we need to understand, it seems to me, is that if we actually want to renew what we think we're all about, the path it may be, at least partially, academic freedom in some institutions, but ultimately it needs to be a vision of the university that's informed by an ideal of the truth, in which we have to be ultimately oriented toward the teaching of the next generation as part of a tradition, part of a collegium, that the truth is always approached through, in, and with the community of other people. And that has to be the aim and purpose toward which we are oriented.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with some of that history. So more specifically, I disagree that it's academic freedom that explains the fragmentation of the modern research university. So that fragmentation had already happened right prior to the AAUP drafting in 1940. Maybe it accelerated it, I don't know. But that fragmentation had by and large already happened. And there are many books that tell the story of, how we went from having a very strong classical education model to having this sort of consumer choice, disciplinary specific model, to our current situation where we live and breathe within our disciplinary silos, not as a matter of choice, but as a matter of the way our institution is structured to make us rationally behave. And that seems to me, it dovetails in interesting ways with questions and concerns about academic freedom, but I don't at all agree that it can be reduced to that. I think there are lots of other forces at work there, forces that by and large were shaped in Germany, which is where you find the rise of the modern research university and was a model that was eventually imported here to the US. I mean, as far as my own university, so I agree that obviously my university in some sense has lost its way. Part of that is that, like, it just wants to increase in the rankings. Right? Like when you meet with administrators, like that's the goal. How are we going to increase in those rankings? And there are various rankings. I'm not just talking about the U.S. News and World Report, but the Carnegie rankings, and that's all a matter of increasing grant dollars and research outputs, and it does. I think it reflects the wrong priorities, and so that is a problem at my institution. And again, I think that it bears on academic freedom, but it's slightly orthogonal in a way as well. I think that at a large flagship state school like the one that I teach at, we do need, so the thing that ties us together ought to be the truth. And I think that maybe I'm in a unique situation in that I do have university administration that is very receptive to this idea. I have a university president that is very willing to talk about the truth and the value of having a community, but it hasn't. In a way, it's all talk. Like, you have to look at how you can actually structure the university, especially in terms of its curriculum, right? One thing that my university really needs to do, and we would need the leadership to do this, is to rethink our Common Core curriculum. Our common curriculum is a joke. And I would be happy to say that to anyone in my administration. I'm sure they already know what I think about that. It's just a hodgepodge of various things that you might study. There's no real direction for students about how they're going to fulfill it. A lot of students just end up in whatever classes were left over because there are just so many students at my university. That all needs to be rethought, and that would be part of the answer to what is the glue that ties us together as a community. I'm much more optimistic, I think, about the university and its prospects than some of the other folks on the stage. But yeah, there needs to be real reform. And I will concede that any talk about academic freedom has to be within this larger context of university education, and that we do need to prioritize in a way that we are not currently doing at R1 institutions undergraduate education. It needs to be the absolute center of the mission.
Okay, I'll try to be very, very brief because I know that there are questions on the apps. I'm a thoroughbred Aristotelian here. We are the faculty, the faculty that distinguishes us from other specimens and other creatures is reason. Reason is a faculty that identifies and organizes the material provided by our senses, and reason has got to be the only uniting factor that, and the common denominator, and the uniting factor that bonds us as a university community. There can be no other criterion besides reason, because reason can be the only thing that adjudicates among disputing truth claims. Feelings cannot be a source of adjudicating truth claims because feelings cannot be shared. You can share your feelings with me, but your feelings can't be shared, can't be felt by a multiplicity of other people. Reason is the one faculty that we all share in common, and reason is the only faculty that is amenable and susceptible to meaning tests that are objective, that are fair, that appeal to an objective reality which one's feelings do not admit of. One's feelings are one's private, subjective standpoint, sources of experiences. And so reason has got to be, for me, the only source that unites seemingly intractable, disparate, irreconcilable tensions, reason is the only adjudicator, I think, that can tie disparate groups, disparate experiences, and unite a multiplicity, a heterogeneity of groups of people together in a university.
Thank you. So a very quick question from the app. How does academic freedom differ between students versus professors? And maybe just a quick, sort of principal dividing line or principal rule you would apply. I'll put that question to kind of each of you in sequence. So go ahead, Patrick.
I guess I would say the following. In theory, we all have academic freedom at probably all of our institutions. Our students have academic freedom to speak in classrooms. They can say more or less almost anything they wish. Faculty can say more or less anything you wish. Of course, there are boundaries that are legal and that are increasingly one finds in human resources departments, which are extra legal. But in practice, any student, and those young people out there will tell you, I'm not saying everything I think in a classroom. I'm not going to say everything I think to someone in my dorm that I don't really know and really trust. I'm not going to, just blurt out something that it turns out might be really controversial, and there are really prudential reasons for this. I think this is just being a human being in a community. Being a human being in a community means that at some level, we've talked about civility earlier, there are certain situations where you say certain things, you say certain words, you express certain ideas, and there are other situations in which you don't. And to me, the question is, what's the form and nature of the human community that we inhabit? There is no human community that doesn't have some form of boundaries, that doesn't have some sort of a boundary. It can be fluid, it can be difficult to ascertain exactly where it lies, but what's the point at which I step over this and I make myself in some ways disreputable within my community? And we might have formal liberty to speak out, but as human beings, we recognize where those boundaries are and the kinds of situations in which certain things can be rightfully said, and certain situations where you may not wish to say or to speak certain things out loud. So the idea or theory of academic freedom is fine and well and good at a certain level, but we all know that human communities have certain boundaries. And so I guess the question and thesis I'm putting here is, what is the nature of the human community that we ideally would wish to see around which the great universities of our nation, that we would wish to support, that we would want to invest our labor, our love, our treasure in order to reformulate. And what's that vision and that goal? Let's not have partial goals in mind, but the full goal. And it's not simply just to say, oh, those terrible administrators at places we can name who are now, want to hire faculty who make a certain statement of faith about DEI that will be tenured on the basis of not just their academic performance, but whether they fit in the community, will be promoted whether they have exhibited faith to that community. Admissions will reflect the commitments now of the DEI orthodoxy. The programming, the curriculum will reflect the commitments of the DEI orthodoxy. All of this makes me profoundly jealous, because this is actually what once was the expected norm of, for example, a Catholic university. A faculty member would have to have a statement of faith in order to be hired at such an institution. They would be expected, even if they didn't believe in every dot and cross T of the faith, that they have respect toward that faith tradition. If they weren't a member of that faith tradition, that they didn't go around trashing it. That the students would have the same comportment and expectation. So to my mind, I guess I'm not sure I'm even answering this question anymore, but to my mind, the aim and purpose should be not to say we must get rid of all of these terrible forms of oppression that we see the administration and the curriculum and so forth today extending, but what's the right form that constitution of the academic community of the society should take?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that students have academic freedom in anything like the sense that, tenure-track faculty have it.
Not tenure-track, tenured.
Yeah, well, yeah, true, fair, very fair. And part of the reason why they don't is because, students are supposed to be, well, education properly understood is a kind of formation. And so in the classroom, part of what's happening, if it's a real education, is that the students are learning how to become truly free. I mean, if we're talking about a liberal education at all. And so, the professor is trying to model, right, what good free inquiry looks like. And it is the responsibility of the professor to create a classroom environment in which students are not terrified to say what they actually think, that they feel comfortable putting forward an idea. Maybe it's half-baked, maybe it's totally wrong, but they feel like they can express what they think, and being able to trust that that classroom is a space where what they say is going to be received in the charitable spirit of some contribution that is trying to get at the truth. And if they are wrong, then that student should be able to expect some sort of correction, right? But what they shouldn't have to deal with is getting this kind of violent reaction because it's the wrong belief, or the exact right language wasn't used, or worried that they are going to be reported, right, for bias or whatever. I mean, one of the things that I have been very dismayed by in the last 10 or so years in higher education is the way that students are encouraged to report one another. It's not conducive to learning, and the kind of safetyism that this kind of therapeutic talk of safetyism, which has totally replaced talk of, for example, fortitude, which is an actual virtue. Again, it's not actually conducive to learning. And I don't think it's even hard to demonstrate that it's not conducive to learning. So, I mean, the simple answer is no, they don't have academic freedom in the same space. However, if the professor is doing his or her job well, they will feel free to speak.
I agree. I agree with you, Jennifer. I think that students do not have the same kind of academic freedom as do professors. In the knowledge hierarchy, they are in a subordinate position. They are in an inferior position because they are young people learning a basic set of facts, not opinions, but facts or viewpoints that have some connection to an outside objective reality that is divested from their own personal opinions. And the only time I think academic freedom comes into play is when we have a really overtly politicized classroom that is usually fostered by ideological or ideologues who happen to be professors who politicize their classrooms. And usually in today's climate, the students who are the victims of this are conservative students in our majority. There are no, short of Hillsdale and a couple of other universities, there are no universities with conservative philosophy professors or English professors or rhetoric professors who are conservative. So it only becomes an issue, I think, when classrooms become overtly politicized, that talk of academic freedom for students become an issue. But if you have a depoliticized classroom in which knowledge is being dispassionately taught, there are close readings of the text. And for example, in my classroom, unless students Google me, which I advise them not to do because I'm all over the internet, but they do it anyway. But unless they Google me, they have no idea that I'm an independent conservative. They have no idea of, when I'm teaching Marx, because I have to teach Marx, they think I'm a Marxist. Because I'm so gung-ho in my reconstruction of his position. When I teach Hegel, they think I'm Hegelian, which I most emphatically am not. And when I teach Aristotle, they think I'm an Aristotelian, which I am. And when I teach Plato, whom I do not like, but I teach him with such passion that they think he's a Platonist. And that's what a professor should do. And the students, to the extent, I tell them, your first right is not your right to utter nonsense. And if you get the text wrong, I have the right to say that you've got it wrong. So I think an atmosphere of a spirit of charity, a spirit of openness, where they have the democratic right to fail and to get the text wrong, but that's not their first right, to utter nonsense and to get away with it, right? So I think it only becomes an issue when the classroom becomes really overtly politicized and students feel that they will be punished for uttering the wrong ideological position.
You know, the only problem with a conversation as deep, rich, and serious as this one is that there's no way to contain it within the space of an hour. So I'm afraid we have reached time. We have a message from Clara Guda, who's going to tell us about our next
adventure this evening.
adventure this evening.
So another big round of applause for all of our excellent speakers today. All right, thank you so much. So as you all know, ISI, we're about ideas and community. We've finished the ideas portion of the evening, and now we move on to the community, which means a party. So we have a cigar and cocktail reception in our back patio, so you're welcome to go straight through the building or around to access that area. We do ask politely that you clear this area out so we can set up for our evening remarks, which will begin at 6. So please be back here at 6. Thanks so much.